In the last episode of Ivory Towers, one contestant reacted poorly to anonymous reviewer criticism, recording this message after a disagreement about diaphragm function.
Now, I'm very concerned for these reviewers because they might not be getting enough oxygen to their brain on account of not being able to breathe properly. So if you're out there and you do know how to breathe, please inform them on how to use their diaphragm. Thank you. I'd like to respond to the allegations and the controversies on the Ivory Towers TV show that aired on YouTube just now because I just made it up. Now, the controversy is around breathing and the action of the diaphragm. Reviewing the literature on the diaphragm, I realize it's hard to isolate the diaphragm and study it, so no one's bothered doing it because they haven't really had a reason. But here's the thing, if you look up any conventional explanation of how hiccups work, they'll tell you that the diaphragm is spasming. Therefore, we don't necessarily need to isolate the diaphragm in some lab experiment if we happen to have the hiccups. I don't have the hiccups right now, but when I did have the hiccups, I made sure to, feel my rib cage, and yes, it expands or starts to expand when you start to hiccup. What's happening when you hiccup is the diaphragm tenses and then a sort of valve in your neck cuts off your airways to prevent yourself suddenly inhaling. So the reason reviewers told me I wasn't allowed to use a reference regarding the diaphragm to say that the diaphragm expands the thoracic cavity outwards is because the reference I tried to use simply said that the diaphragm expands the thoracic cavity. It didn't specify, does the cavity expand outwards or just downwards? This is a reference from like the 70s. So the rest of this video is just going to be me using this pipe and these ropes to try and explain how I think muscle can push outwards, something I've demonstrated elsewhere, and how this action represents the diaphragm pushing outwards. And just to be clear, basically all the literature, really all the literature just assumes that muscle is always stretched. So the filaments are stretched out like this and they pull each other together like that. I'm focused on what if it's not stretched? What if it's compressed? Okay, so I've made this model of the muscle, the compressed muscle, but first I just want to show you how I made this so you understand what it's supposed to represent. So I've got this tubing which is supposed to be like the outer sheath of the muscle or the muscle fiber. And this is going to act like the threads, two different filaments that act within the muscle. So I'll just pull this through. Shit. And these threads are going to represent the filaments within a muscle that make the action of the muscle happen. We've got two filaments. I'm going to tie one end on here to represent that one filament is anchored to one end, and then I'm going to tie the other thread on the other end to represent that it's anchored to this end of the cell. And they can only grip each other where they're overlapping. So when I pull these threads, the threads form a straight line, and that straight line is 13 inches long. Now I'm going to cut either end of these things while it's stretched. Okay. So now that I've cut the threads, I hope you can see this, but there's parts in here where there's no overlap. So there's just one thread and then it overlaps over here. Now the filaments can only work where there's overlap because they're essentially grabbing each other and pulling each other along. And there's some, there's the overlap and there's the empty space at the other end. Now, we have to agree that if these threads were able to pull each other along, they would eventually go straight, and this whole system would straighten out and push outwards. And that's how muscles push. There's something wrong with this model in that the outer casing is very rigid. Muscles are able to stretch. The way I cut these is they were in here, I pulled out and then I pulled and then cut. Pulled and then cut. But now that they're outside of this tube, I can't even pull them to be the same length when straight. But what I can do is have like a zigzag or a spiral and get that to be the same length. So with the materials I'm using, this outer shell is fairly tough in a way that the sheath wouldn't be in the muscle. But it's my contention that the filaments behave differently. When they're gripping each other, they create a tensegrity strength. They are a structure in and of themselves if they're tensed. So if I were to push against this straight thing and they were tensed, it would push back against me. If it's relaxed, it doesn't. But when it's tensed, it not only becomes straight, but it can push outwards and potentially even stretch itself longer. So if I've got a straight, flat muscle lying here and it's relaxed, it might seem like I'm saying when it tenses, it will lengthen. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying when it tenses, it's lengthened like this. When it's relaxed, it's more like that. So the ends of the muscle stay the same length, tensed or relaxed. But there's some slack in the filaments when it's relaxed. So the reason people think that the diaphragm could never push outwards, only push downwards, is because you've got these filaments either end. And as you can see, this piece of string here is the same length as the filaments. So yeah, a straightening body could push outwards, but the muscle is shortening as it's straightening. So in this case, this filament here is going to stretch out, but it's only going to get to there, and vice versa. So the whole system will straighten but not push outwards. Now, in order to get the system to push outwards, there's only two things that need to happen. One, if this outer shell is stretchy, and I pull this thing sort of like a slingshot, and I pull it and stretch it, and the sides go in as it's stretched, now the filaments aren't overlapping as much. The filaments are pulled outwards because the outer shell is stretching. Now, when it tenses, it's going to push outwards. Alternatively, if I can compress this thing and the filaments are rigid enough that they then stretch out like this and now they're not overlapping as much, then they can push outwards, even as they're seemingly pulling together. Another adaptation, or another way we could think about it, is these filaments within here could just grow longer. Life is so adaptable, and in particular the muscles are adaptable. That is such a simple and easy solution, it seems unlikely that it wouldn't naturally happen. The real adaptation that needs to happen is within our brains of how we think about muscle and stuff like this, because this hasn't been tested. They haven't really paid enough attention to the diaphragm. They've just looked at it and assumed that it's going to act as they would think it would if it were a different muscle, but you have to think about what's going on inside. So in this model, what I've done is I've just pulled it taut and just made a mark with a pen where the thread came out of the inner shell. That way I can pull either side of these and it will simulate the two filaments grabbing each other and pulling themselves along and shortening. What I can't do, and this is a little bit tricky, I can't get the exact right materials to simulate the muscle, and this outer shell is very rigid and not stretchy. But when I pull on these cords, it will compress the outer shell and the whole system enough that if I play it in reverse, I can simulate the compressed muscle stretching outwards, which is how I believe it would behave. So in the straightened muscle, just sort of at rest, we would expect the threads to go the full way along the system. And then at that point, tensing the muscle isn't going to change the length at all, because the threads are grabbing each other, they're holding on, but they've got nowhere to go. They can't go further than the muscle itself. So that sort of 0 point is the same length regardless of whether it's tensed or relaxed. So I'm going to pull on this, but first we'll measure from start to finish. This is 13 inches. And then when I pull it, it's probably going to go. Can I even measure it? So it's currently about 21 inches. If that muscle had tensed, it would have pushed outwards. So I want to show that even in a situation where the diaphragm isn't pushing outwards when it tenses, if this is the relaxed diaphragm, it stretches out in order to curve, but there's a bunch of stuff underneath the diaphragm. So when it pushes down, there's an equal and opposite reaction upwards. So yes, it will straighten again, but it's not going to straighten like this, where it just goes down to the exact same point and is now straight. Now the force is pushing up, and that force, if we could represent it by putting my fingers here, is pushing up, and it's going to stretch out the rib cage.